All right, everyone, it is 8 o'clock, so I'm going to ask everyone to mute themselves so we can begin. Dr. Lieber, you're good. Just the rest of everyone. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is Drisha's spring program and this Pew Team of Shavuot class. It is the second Pew Team of Shavuot class this week. We also have another one tomorrow evening. We encourage everyone to turn on your video if you are able. We understand if not. Also, please feel free to ask questions or you can comment. I guess we decided, yeah, people can unmute to ask questions, right, Dr. Lieber? I think that's fine. Okay, so people can unmute when they have questions. I think Dr. Lieber will also allow specific times for questions. If you're watching us live on Facebook, you can also write your questions as a comment. In this session, we will examine the liturgical poem Akdamut Millin, the introduction of words, written by Rabbi Meir Isaac of Worms, with an eye toward understanding its origins and its enduring appeal. Why would Rabbi Meir compose such a lengthy poem in Aramaic, long after Aramaic ceased to be the vernacular of the Jewish community? And what meaning can such a work have for us today? It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Lieber. Dr. Lieber is Professor of Religious Studies and Classical Studies at Duke University, where she also directs the Center for Jewish Studies. She received her BA in English and Classics from the University of Arkansas, rabbinic ordination from Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and her PhD from the University of Chicago. Her most recent book is Jewish Aramaic Poetry from Antiquity. Her translation of classical Samaritan Piyut is forthcoming, and she's currently writing on the topic of theatricality. I'm Israeli, forgive me. Theatricality and late antique hymnody. With that, I'll turn this to Dr. Lieber.
Thank you very much for inviting me to share with you a topic about which really I don't get into the medieval period very often. And this is a Piyut, Akdamut Millin, which is really entirely medieval. And but it endures, and actually I will confess that in putting together a PowerPoint for today, I spent far too much time noodling around in medieval manuscripts, because the medieval German Jewry left us so many beautifully illuminated machzors and haggadot and other things, which I think illuminate aspects of this poem as well. And I think perhaps as a text person, I always love pictures. Not just pictures of manuscripts. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you just because I think that sort of takes the place of a handout that I might sort of more directly walk you through. And I also want to tell you that I'm happy to send a copy of the PowerPoint to anybody who's interested in, especially I have sources and things on a lot of the images in the notes. So if you're curious where I found that picture. So
I also put it in the chat right now, the source sheet, just so everyone knows.
Yeah, and the source sheet is primarily just the text of Akdamut, because it's a very long poem. And it's also, and I gave a brief bibliography of works that I drew on in this, or works that sort of will lead you further down various rabbit holes. I certainly went down lots of rabbit holes in working on this. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. So, okay. I'm going to, whoops. So, okay, so I'm going to give just a brief introduction to what the Piyut is, so that everybody, because it may be more familiar to some than to others. And so it's an extended poetic preface to the first Aliyah for the Torah reading on the morning of Shavuot, on the first day. And it originally has sort of a complicated history. It used to actually be read, sort of interrupted the Torah reading originally because it was connected to the reading of the Aramaic translation, the Targum of the Torah, which was also read in the synagogue, even in the Middle Ages, when Rabbi Meir Bar Isaac composed the work, even though Aramaic was not the vernacular of his community, but it held Aramaic in a way sort of like a secondary to Hebrew, had this sort of aura of sanctity about it, and as sort of a heavenly language. And so originally it actually interrupted the Torah service. Eventually, in the later Middle Ages, it was moved to just before the first Aliyah. Its author, Rabbi Meir Bar Isaac Nehorai of Orleans, was the prayer leader of the Jewish community in Worms. This is one of the famous sort of cities of Shum, the Speyer, Mainz, and Worms, which was a heartland, really, sort of Jews in Ashkenaz in the Rhineland. Rabbi Meir died in 1095, just prior to the massacres of the First Crusade, which Gezerot Tatnu, the decrees of 4856. So which left a tremendous scar on the psyche and as well as on many bodies of Jews in Ashkenaz. And this connection of the city of Worms to the First Crusade is deeply connected to the folk tale that appears in Yiddish, which I'll talk about briefly, which was widely circulated. It arose generations after the composition of Akdamut, but it gives this very powerful and moving folktale background to the Piyut, which is certainly part of the reason, quite possibly, why it persisted, despite the fact that its language is very difficult and it's probably not necessarily sort of the meaningfulness of the words that was so powerful for people. And one of the things I'm going to sort of point out as we sort of survey the lay of the land of Akdamut and its origins is that in many ways, this sort of combination of the poem and this legend is very Ashkenazi. It participates a lot in what will also become very important for Hasidei Ashkenaz, but it's not an exclusively Ashkenazi impulse. So. The poem is quite long. That may be one of the things that most people know about it. It's 90 lines long. So if you're one of those people like I have occasionally been, who sort of like flips through the prayer book to see how much longer we have before a certain break, Akdamut can be intimidating. It's a double alphabetical acrostic for the first half. So it goes Aleph, Aleph, Bet, Bet, Gimel, Gimel, followed by 46 verses that embed a signature acrostic, which is a very classical feature of this sort of medieval poem, which Rabbi Meir Bar Isaac, may he be great in Torah and in good deeds, amen, chazak v'amatz. So every line of this poem is 10 syllables, and the final syllable of each line, which is easy to do in Aramaic, is tav. Now, tav and aleph signify the endless cycle of Torah learning. As soon as you are finished, back to the beginning. It's sort of the opposite of one might say sort of alpha and omega. It's omega and alpha. And this actually leads to their resonances between Akdamut Millin and Simchat Torah, and also signifies perhaps sort of the ongoing nature of revelation. For those of you who looked at the text in advance and were like, oh my goodness, you do not feel alone. The language is infamously opaque. The art scroll Shavuos Machzor calls it terse, difficult Aramaic. And Galinkin, in a response somewhere, he suggests actually replacing Akdamut with selections from Psalm 119, refers to it as a unique Aramaic of the 11th century, so difficult that even rabbinic scholars may have problems deciphering it. There are various musical settings of the work. There's sort of a Sinai melody, which is very similar, if you hear it, to the festival Kiddush. There's what's called a psalmic or psalmodic chant that resembles the Chatan Torah and Chatan Bereshit melody from Simchat Torah. And there's an old sort of German folk melody, which has largely fallen out of use, but it was attested. And the other thing that's interesting is that there's also the antiphonal nature of its performance. So it's participatory. And actually, in some ways, especially for this period in the sort of high Middle Ages of Piyut, one of the most important aspects, I think, of what makes a Piyut popular can be the experiential and the sound and participatory elements, and the words could be far less meaningful. I sometimes think of this as the, they're sort of like, there's a Adon Olam and other works, which we all sort of like, you don't even think about really what the words that you're saying so much as you get caught up in the melody and the experience of being with other people singing it. So Lecha Dodi is another one. I don't think everyone is contemplating the various tikkunim of sfirot that they're participating in when they're singing along. They're often just sort of enjoying the more sort of contextual elements, the ambiance of participating in such a song. Yaakov Emden is the one who referred to Akdamut as estimable, precious in my eyes. He's also one who said it should not interrupt the Torah reading. And just a quick Google. So Reb Google says, I found these sort of interesting, beloved and bizarre. It's perhaps my favorite of European congregations that could be inflected in different ways to reflect different kinds of judgment. Judaism's best known and most beloved piyut. Some might quibble with that. A masterpiece. However, we also have here the opinion of, I've pulled out Elbogen, whose famous work, Jewish Liturgy, A Comprehensive History, said these poems were, so let's see, oops, my little screen is blocking my word, were never intelligible, but now with the elimination of the Aramaic translation that they were intended to introduce, they have completely lost their significance and their right to exist. That's pretty harsh, although Elbogen never pulls punches. Marcus Adler, when he cut it from the official British liturgy, referred to it simply as expendable. Even now, many prayer books may publish the Aramaic, but paraphrase in the English or offer an alternative or just skip it entirely. I know growing up in a congregation that really lived by the academic calendar, Shavuos didn't always even make it into the calendar rotation when the rabbis were around. Golinkin in his responsum writes, the pious generations of the past recited Akdamut because it was there. It was there in the prayer book, and you ask no questions. Today, people want to know what they are doing and why. So now Akdamut needs some good PR. So I just wanted to, because it's, like I said, it's 90 lines long, 45 stanzas, give a sort of a quick overview because it's not chaotically organized. That would be fairly unbearable. So it has a clear kind of outline. It articulates the challenge of trying to praise God, sort of a poetic conceit. Then it moves to creation, a description of the angelic hosts and the heavenly liturgy, which ties in very nicely sort of with, if you think about the Haftarah for the first day of Shavuot with Ezekiel 1 and 3:12, so the Kedusha. Then it depicts the prayers of Israel as being superior. Once we're in the human realm, then the nations enter the stage and the nations express wonder and delight and try to essentially seduce Israel to join them. Israel spurns their advances, and we have what really can be considered a wedding feast that God hosts for Israel, including a reference to the battle of Behemoth and Leviathan, who become the meat course and the fish course for the banquet of the righteous. And then it concludes with a benediction and petition. And on this other page, the illustration is of, I couldn't find a date on this manuscript, but I wanted to show it because you can see how the manuscript lays out the formal aspects of the poem. In that, in red letters, on the right-hand margin, you have the letters. It's the very end of Yigdal B'Torah. So Yigdal B'Torah, Ma'asim Tovim, and then the ta final syllable of each line at the end. So that really emphasizes the form over sort of the content of the work in a way. The form itself is very important. There is a long tradition of Aramaic poetry. This I can speak about from my previous book. There's a number of poetic editions. They're often preserved in Targum manuscripts. And so, especially for Shabbat Shirah, this parting of the sea, and the death of Moses, those are two very popular. So in a way, sort of like this middle point of the Torah and the end of the Torah. Akdamut replaced an older, shorter Aramaic piyut, which offered a very dramatic, mythic vision of the moment of revelation. It has Moses battling the angels to acquire the Torah. Actually, it's a poem I'm quite fond of, but Akdamut Millin replaced it, and that's interesting to think about why. The earliest text of Akdamut we have is really quite early, 1279, and it's first mentioned as being a part of the Shavuot liturgy in the 15th century in halachic literature, and appears in sort of a prayer book, as we would think of it, in the 16th century. So, and the original setting, as I've mentioned, after the first verse of the Torah reading, became a problem once it stopped being an introduction to, once there stopped being a Targum, an Aramaic translation to introduce. So I'm going to, if I'm not missing any questions, I have trouble, I can't see, but I'll just sort of, okay.
There is actually one question. What is the name of the other poem about Moshe battling the angels?
I can't think of it right now. It's in my, it's one of the ones I treat in my book. But it's it's a short one. It's an alphabetical acrostic. It's 22 lines. I want to say Arkin Moshe, I think is what, yes. And Moses uses his horns, because God has given him horns, and he uses them like and the angels complain that he's like a goring ox. It's really quite dramatic. But not as sort of, not quite as dignified as Akdamut Millin. So in terms of going through this, here we have another manuscript page of Akdamut Millin. This is from the Worms Mahzor, which is interesting because actually Worms was a place where it was not always traditionally said. And you can see sort of the red letters appear to indicate sort of like the grouping it into stanzas for participation or something. This is a cantor's personal Mahzor, presumably. And also this Worms Mahzor contains the earliest known text of Yiddish on a different page. So here we have just some beautiful poetic descriptions about how impossible it is to describe sort of God's wondrous majesty. And essentially it's a poetic conceit where the poet says it's impossible to do it, so I'm going to try. But I do think that this language has been quite evocative and has become sort of had influence. And you know, like where the sky's parchment and all the reeds quills, where all the seas and waters made of ink. So was every person a scribe. That idea that even if that were all true, it would not be possible to praise, to state God's true majesty and wonder. So this, in a way, it's very similar to what we see in like the Shir Yichud and other sort of texts that we associate with the Ashkenazi liturgical tradition from a little bit later, so like the Hasidei Ashkenaz. We have sort of like, I'm sort of skipped over some of the creation story and the angelology, which is, I mean, the angelic liturgy is very interesting. The angelic liturgy, it's phrases that we would know from the Kedusha in the contemporary sort of, you know, what becomes, you know, sort of the statutory prayers. So holy, 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 and and then Ezekiel 3:12, and then there's a whole sort of assertion that the angelic prayer is nice, but what God really loves are the prayers of Israel. And as I mentioned, this, you know, sort of this praise of Israel leads to sort of a sense that the nations begin to sort of like take notice of the Israelites, the Jews, and the nations come and gather together like the surging waves. This again is sort of echoing what we see in like Parshat Yitro, in the Torah reading, you know, sort of the fact that the idea that the nations have heard about what God has done for Israel and how much God loves Israel. And then we have this Wenson, who is your beloved, O fair one, for whom do you die in the lion's den? And this petition, you know, mingle with us, we will do your will throughout the world. And then the poet, speaking sort of as Israel personified, says, with wisdom I answer them concisely, and I give them a stiff arm. And this, I think, when you read it, it begins to resemble it sounds a lot like the passage in the Mechilta, like a much earlier midrash from the Tannaitic midrash from the 2nd century, with Rabbi Akiva explicating the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, Ze Livan Vehu, this is my God and I will glorify him. And then the nations sort of say, oh, the first they say, what's your God that you die for him all the time? And then Akiva says, I'll tell you a little bit about him. And they're like, oh, let us join with you. And Akiva says, no, Ani Ladodi Vadodi Li, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. We're exclusive, beat it. So this is sort of that similar sort of an aggressive courtship that Israel rejects. And one line of thinking is that this actually this push and pull with the nations and the tell me about your God and mingle with us and things, it sort of reflects, if nothing else, I think the engagements of various kinds possibly sort of with the non-Jews. The Jews and Christians were not living sort of hermetically sealed away from each other, but were engaging with each other. And so here we have pictures of sort of various kinds of disputations and arguments. And that sort of this poem reflects that sort of give and take with the non-Jews over claims to God's love and also sort of the implicit idea of power. We'll do your will throughout all the world. The idea that Israel right now has no power, so earthly power and heavenly power. And then after Israel has declared herself sort of exclusive with God, then we move to what is really essentially a description of a banquet that functions in some ways as a wedding reception. And there's lots of ginunei and sort of various terms here which are suggestive in various ways of sort of marriage rituals. So he shall cover them with his glory, a canopy for that nation to adorn with praises. So this is God setting up the banquet, setting up the reception, chairs and 7 levels, and setting up the banquet for the righteous, and then the righteous will dance in a circle with the Shekhinah. So I would commend to you the article that I mentioned that's in the bibliography by Jeffrey Hoffman. He does a very nice translation of all of Akdamut with lots of careful footnotes that are for a lot of the intertextual references here. It's very hard to translate a poem without just filling it up with footnotes. And he has some nice, I've sort of used, done some of my sort of adapted my translation and his translation and the translation from Sefaria. So there's no single translation can capture all that's going on in this work, but Hoffman's article is marvelous. And then we have, because you can't have a banquet without eating, we have the mythical main courses. It's a very briefly told contest between Leviathan and Behemoth, which is an old sort of motif. It comes out of the end of the book of Job, where you have Behemoth and Leviathan, sort of this primordial beast. Sort of the Leviathan is the primordial sea creature. Behemoth is the sort of ultimate land animal. In medieval artwork, you also will often find Zs, the bird, the rock. It's like the rock from Greek mythology. But the ox, and so Behemoth and Leviathan fight each other. And there's this appears in Lamentations Rabbah. It appears in a late antique poem by Kalir. In the Lamentations Rabbah version, Leviathan and Behemoth slaughter each other in a kosher manner. In more often, God enters and takes care of the shechting of the creatures so that they may be served properly to the righteous. In the late antique traditions, these are always framed in terms of those who avoided going to the violent games of the Roman arena are rewarded by this spectacle that is far superior to anything that the Romans ever put on. Here, this is just part of the spectacle that the righteous will behold. And here we have, from, again, a little bit after Rabbi Meir, some images from the Ambrosiana Bible, where you can see, these pages are actually on top of each other if I split them up so they can be a little bigger on the slide. And you see Behemoth and Leviathan and the Z's, sort of this griffin-like creature representing the three realms of creation. And then the other panel is the banquet of the righteous, where they're eating all these things in their musical instruments. And they all have various sorts of animal heads, and crowns. And so that's the banquet of the righteous, where they eat Leviathan and Behemoth. So I'll pause now for any other questions that you may have. And I can be a little hypnotized by that book flipping image.
Feel free to unmute, or if you feel more comfortable, you can raise your hand using the raise hand button on Zoom if you'd like to ask a question now. No pressure.
So there'll be more time for questions afterwards if anyone just sort of is trying to get their thoughts together.
Seems like we're good for now.
Okay. So I'm going to outline for you here the Maisa Akdamut. This is the legend that Hoffman's article focuses on. He does obviously a much more thorough treatment, but I'm going to highlight some of the pieces that I'm particularly interested in here from the story. So the story is that in 1361, a monk sorcerer begins to attack and kill Jews throughout the Rhineland. And he eventually gives the Jews 1 year to produce a champion who can defeat him in a sorcery contest. So there's an excellent folkloric setup. The Jews fast, send out letters seeking a champion, and practice teshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah. So there should be, I think you should be hearing here echoes of both the book of Esther and the high holiday poem Unatana Tokef, but to no avail. Eventually, as the years passing, time through an hourglass, an elder learns in a dream that the rescuer must come from one of the lost tribes beyond the river Sambatyon. So Rabbi Meir, the author of our poem, goes as an emissary, taking very literally the term shaliach tzibur, but he has to cross the river Sambatyon on Shabbat, which is forbidden. He does so because of pikuach nefesh, to save the Jews of his community. The Jews of the lost tribes consult, and they eventually choose among themselves a champion to send back to Worms, who happens to be a feeble, old, bent, very unimpressive specimen of a human being that everyone is very concerned about, but obviously this is sort of a ploy that will help lower the expectations of the evil wizard. And so this champion will go back to Worms, but Rabbi Meir can never return. So he never goes back to his homeland. And the champion defeats the evil monk on Erev Shavuot, which happens to be the last day that they had before their time ran out. And after his victory in this sorcery contest, he reveals to the Jews that Rabbi Meir composed a poem, Akdamut, and taught it to him before he boarded the boat to cross the river Sambatyon and go back to Germany. And that Rabbi Meir asked the Jews of his community recite this poem every year on Shavuot. So there are a couple of things in this Maisa, this story, they're threads I'm pulling on. And the first one is on dreams and poetry. Because as I mentioned, that the resonances of some of the story with Unatana Tokef, I think Unatana Tokef is perhaps the most famous, in my experience, folk tale about folkloric backstory for a piyut, because that is the story of Rabbi Amnon of Mainz, Mainz being one of the other cities of Shum. There's Speyer, Mainz, and Worms. So Akdamut comes from Worms, and Amnon is from Mainz. And Amnon is martyred because he refuses to convert to Christianity. And actually, in a motif that is attested in Christian martyrology as well, he is brutally sort of mutilated, and all of his limbs are cut off, and he's eventually carried dying into the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah where he sings Unatana Tokef and then expires. Or in some versions of the story, he is just taken up to heaven, apparently. There's a lot of influence, I think, here of sort of the Christian narratives. 3 days after his death or disappearance, Amnon appears to his student, Rabbi Kalonymus bar Meshulam. Kalonymus bar Meshulam does die in the First Crusade, but Amnon appears to his student in a dream and asks him to transcribe the poem and ensure that it's recited every year on Rosh Hashanah. Kalonymus bar Meshulam is of the Kalonymide family, which is very important in the history of Ashkenazi Jewry, especially. They were credited with bringing the traditions, the mysteries and secrets of prayer from the land of Israel up through Italy and into the Rhineland. The legend of Rabbi Amnon is first told by Rabbi Isaac Or Zerua in the 13th century in Germany, who attributes it to Ephraim of Bonn. And Ephraim of Bonn, if you've ever read The Last Trial by Shalom Spiegel, Ephraim of Bonn wrote that poem that's the subject of that book. What's interesting about this folk tale is that Unatana Tokef is obviously definitively much older than this medieval etiology, in that we have a Geniza text that dates the 8th century, and based on its style, it's likely composed in the 6th. So it's a similar sort of folklore backstory for a poem that was already in use, but in this case, an even older poem than Akdamut Millin. So here I just sort of am thinking that we have sort of these two rabbis who are, as we would say, from away. So Rabbi Meir of Orleans and Kalonymus, who's from this Italian family. They've come to the Rhineland, presumably because it's the intellectual seat of Ashkenazi Jewry, like Rashi. And both rabbis, Rabbi Kalonymus died in 1096, Rabbi Meir died in 1095, and they both were associated with communities that were ravaged by the Crusades. Each poem is revealed in proximity to a holiday, Shavuos or Rosh Hashanah. And in some fashion, each author is sort of dies for a cause, the martyr. Rabbi Meir joins the lost tribes and becomes lost to his people, according to this tradition. Rabbi Amnon, who was probably not actually really a person, but he is explicitly martyred in the folk tale. And Rabbi Kalonymus was part of a mass suicide when confronted by the Crusades. And even the champion who came from beyond the Sambatyon never gets to return to his people. So there's a sense of sort of death and dislocation and migration sort of in the folk tales that accompanied these two poems, Unatana Tokef and Akdamut Millin. The other little rabbit hole I went down, which I wanted to share with you just because it was intriguing, is this Sambatyon River, which appears, it's actually, Pliny the Elder mentions it as a river in Judea that dries up every Shabbat. So it's named Sabbatyon. Josephus writes of it that his account, it was dry for 6 days and only flowed on Shabbat. It appears that Rabbi Meir encountered the one of Pliny because he had to cross when it was not, when it had to cross on Shabbat. So also in rabbinic writings, we have references to it in Targum Pseudo-Jonathan and in Bereshit Rabbah. It's unnavigable on weekdays because it flowed with strong currents, carrying along stones of tremendous force, but it rested on Shabbat. And this really, I think sort of echoes ideas from, if we think about the Christian stories of Prester John and the kingdom of the Khazars, this idea that somewhere beyond sort of the known world is this realm where, in this case, the 10 lost tribes are there, which is why the champion comes from the tribe of Dan. What surprised me was I had not actually known that Christians also believe that 10 lost tribes live beyond the river Sambatyon. But to Christians, and this is a distinctly German tradition, they were wicked, mighty Jews who posed a threat to Christendom as they would invade Europe during the tribulations of the end of days. And they're known as the Red Jews, the Rote Juden, the Rote Jidele. So a story of the Jews found empowering was shared with Christians who found the story scary. And so this is actually a church window, and you can see the Jews in their little Jew hats, the Judenhood. So it's a window from St. Mary's Church, and they're beyond the river. And the whole sort of idea of being red is apparently because in Christian traditions, they're connected to Edom and Gog and Magog, and Edom, Adom, red. So there's a lot. I have at least one article in your bibliography on this motif, which doesn't have a whole lot to do with Akdamut Millin, but between this picture and the way it suggests the common interplay between the Jews and Christians in the Rhineland, I found too interesting to not share with you. Okay, back to Akdamut. This is a much more modern than 19th century Polish woodcut of Leviathan and Behemoth, but that's just to illustrate the long duration of this motif. So what I would say is we have sort of here two impulses. There's sort of the impulse to mourn and the impulse to hope, which I think help explain sort of the persistence of Akdamut, in that legend, as Hoffman argues, I think very persuasively, and his article had a big impact on how this hymn is understood, reflects the impulses among the Jews of the Rhineland to both grieve and to persist, because it gives it this mythical and yet precarious sense of the moment of Ashkenazi Jewry. Sort of, it's a mythical, and yet it does resonate with the sense that there were evil forces out to get the Jews, but the Jews would endure. So by giving Rabbi Meir a story that is both a victory and a tragedy, the Jews are saved, but Rabbi Meir is lost. The Yiddish legend integrates the Jews of the Rhineland into a much larger and more powerful Jewish polity. And here I think it is that connection with these red Jews beyond the Sambatyon River in a way that's sort of similar to the yearning for, whether it was Christians looking for Prester John or Jews seeking to connect with the Khazars. This idea that you have friends who are powerful but just far away, but who might still come to your rescue. Akdamut thus also becomes a hymn of resistance. Its power is amplified by this backstory of tragedy and courage. But as entertaining and evocative as I find this folktale, I still found myself wondering why Rabbi Meir wrote it. Because Rabbi Meir died in 1095, so before the First Crusade, and the legend postdates him. And if we assume it is legendary, then there was some reason that the poem itself merited this folktale, if you want to think of it that way. So what about this poem evoked this interesting a backstory in the first place? And so here I would say that this is not a martyrological poem. It is not a poem that is about death, but it is about love and triumph. And that's why I highlighted all the sort of the superiority of Israel and the wedding banquet imagery from the poem earlier. And here it's the fact that I think also the Shavuot is connected to Passover, and Passover, it's the Song of Songs. And I think of this as being sort of the Song of Songs, and Passover becomes sort of the elopement of God and Israel. They flee Israel, they run away from mom and dad to be together in the wilderness. It's passionate, erotic, hectic, and the focus is really very much on God and Israel at that moment. Shavuot's Megillah Ruth is really far more tranquil and in a way sort of adult, mature, I don't know. It's about commitment, marriage, covenant. Ruth, when she goes to the threshing room floor, takes great risk, but for the cause, not just of herself, but of Naomi and her husband's familial line and the salvation of her, sort of the endurance of her people. And it's also, but it still has that sort of version of eroticism and the consummation. It also, the poem itself reminds me of, as I said, Mechilta Shirta on Ze'eli Van Vehu, and this tradition of using the Song of Songs and this its language of exclusivity as a way of resisting Rome, which really comes to be understood as sort of all of Christendom. And so if Exodus is the elopement, then Sinai is the wedding. And we see in this poem that the clouds are described in the form that's like a chuppah. The Torah in this and various other traditions becomes a ketubah. There's the motif of wedding crowns, klilim, and the motif of circle dancing. The end time banquet becomes a wedding feast. And so I'd say sort of that the motifs in Akdamut Millin of mutuality, reciprocity, and exclusiveness, where God chooses Israel and Israel chooses God, the delight that they take in each other to the exclusion of those who would try to horn their way in, is truly important, and is part of, I think, the reason why this poem had such an appeal. And I think it's part of why it had more appeal than Arki Moshe, which, for all of its drama and its fun, doesn't have sort of the theological depth of this product of Ashkenaz. And so Shavuot, in a way, becomes the renewal of vows for God and Israel. Every year, it's their anniversary. And this impulse, as I mentioned, the Akdamut Millin is a very Ashkenazi poem, but in Sephardic Judaism, we see something very similar. That most sort of concrete example is the Shavuot Ketubah, which is a poem written by Israel Najara, who, in the same way that the Ashkenazi poetry was transformed really by the experience of the persecutions of the Crusades, Israel Najara is from the a couple generations after the expulsion from Spain. He's writing in Sfat. And he wrote this Shavuot Ketubah, which uses the language of a Jewish marriage contract, but it's a marriage contract between God and Israel. And so here we have one from Italy in the 17th or 18th century. You see Moses and Aaron are the two witnesses. And I think sort of this idea is sort of like a response to persecution, trauma, that rather than sort of giving up, it actually causes people to double down and renew their commitments. So, and here we have another Shavuot Ketubah with a text by Israel Najara, which I do include the catalog copy from JTS, just because it has sort of the Ketubah for Shavuot, and Moses witness, Aaron witness, and the kinds of things that are promised in the dowry are a heart that will understand, ears that hearken, eyes that see. You get so these are the sorts of things that are promised in the Ketubah. But so this is sort of a similar, I would say, sort of impulse to use Shavuot as this form of renewal of vows between God and Israel. It's even more concrete in the Sephardic tradition, but Akdamut Millin, I think, reflects something similar. So here we have, this is the actual panel from that, the Ambrosiana Bible, where you have Behemoth, Ziz, and Leviathan, and then the banquet down below. So, which is also creation and end times. I think it's the end piece, the end illustration of the Bible. I think it connects the end of the creation story with the rewards of the righteous yet to come. And then this is from another medieval German Bible. We have the revelation of the Torah here, Moses taking the two tablets. And down below, we have the scene from Ruth, which Vayehi is the Hebrew word under there, but just that scene of the harvest connecting the two. Here, I guess this is another one of those illustrations that I just found myself pondering. This is the manuscript it's the wedding of Moses and Zipporah. So that's Zipporah, apparently her mother, the rabbi raising a really large Kiddush cup, musician entertaining the couple. And what I wanted to point out here was the fact we have here, he's putting, Moses is extending the wedding ring to her, to Zipporah, to put on her finger. She has a very long finger, makes it easy. But just the way the crown, and there's sort of the belt buckle, the clasp, the ring, the prominence really of the circles, which I actually would connect with the ta, the sort of circular nature of that syllable that ends every single line of Akdamut Millin, the fact that you come full circle, you go from tav to aleph, tav to aleph, tav to aleph, the way that circling is such an important part of the Jewish wedding. Obviously, we even have the custom of the bride circling the groom or the two circling each other now. But just this is connected. The article that's associated with this is it's on the Jewish treasures from Erfurt. But just the beautiful sort of the depiction of the woman's wedding garb is, I think, especially appealing here. And then we have other images of weddings. This one, these are all from Passover source where there's still the Timil Vanon is a poem. And just to highlight for you this one, here, the ET you have there, the bride is actually crowned and blindfolded. So this is actually a Jewish manuscript evoking the imagery of the synagogue from Christian art, where synagogue is always blindfolded because the Jews can't see the truth of Christianity, whereas ecclesia is crowned and triumphant. So here we see sort of Jews subverting, a Jewish illustrator subverting that motif. And here we have her lover, who in some fashion represents the divinity, wearing his little Jew hat and courting Israel. So sort of like courtly love and God and Israel, and a fascinating intermingling of Jewish and Christian conventions in this visual piece, embellishing a pute for Passover. We don't have time. I want you to have this link. It's from last year of the global cantors, so the cantors of the conservative movement, performing Akdamut. It's beautiful. It's to the tune that the Sinai melody, which will sound a lot like a festival kiddush. It's on YouTube, but it takes 14 minutes long. But anyway, it's you should save it and watch it later. And the sad thing is, of course, in the introduction, they say that they're doing it last year, and they're hoping it's the last time that we'll be socially distanced for the holidays. I think that there's a good chance that we're probably not quite there yet. So we still have this for another year. And at the first and at the end, full circle, time for questions. So that's a quotation from the final stanza of Akdamut Millin. But I'm going to stop sharing.
I have a question. Other than the whole dispute as to whether it should be before the bracha of the Torah or after, was there rabbinic opposition to the piyut in its entirety because of its content, or was it more or less accepted?
The content was not a problem. I think it was, in some ways it's probably sort of less theologically provocative than like, Shir Yichud, Anim Zmirot. I think so, and it's by the time period where these piyutim were convention, were sort of normal. So I think it's not like in late antiquity where the poetry, the poems themselves were including them in the liturgy at all was controversial. So that's why I think Yaakov Emden, when he's arguing in the 18th century that we need to move where it occurs, he's still sort of very careful to say that it's a beautiful, important poem. We have to sort of keep it, but we just need to, put it in a slightly more appropriate location.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
So you say that it was wildly popular, but no one understood it. So that's, how does that happen?
In general, I think this is where I say with music, and I think that's part of we don't know sort of how it was sung. We have these different, sort of traditions of melodies that accompanied it. But I think that there were clearly, number one, we could imagine that there were sort of paraphrases of it were giving. It could have been introduced in some way that people would have known roughly what they were singing about. I think the melody itself was part of its appeal. I think the participatory nature were sort of like done in these sort of antiphonally, that those sorts of parts of the ambiance of it. And it, I mean, it may be that I think you don't get every word, but you get some words, and the words that you're getting are, I mean, they're, there are parts of them, there are no, there really aren't any dark spots in the hymn. So I think, it's not like you're sort of going to catch, it's not like the martyrologies where you understand them and they're sad. This is sort of, I think the words that you're catching are sort of uplifting. So I think, I mean, in a way, sort of like the problem with its lack of whether or not they understood it or not. That's really more sort of, I think it was more our problem than their problem. I think, because it's up to us to try to think about maybe what are we missing. Also, I mean, the fact that our aesthetics changed. I think sometimes, what they considered in various other periods good literature, and I'm saying that. I always remember when I started working in the late antique pew team, but also I did some medieval material, that one of my teachers said, when are you going to work on good poetry? He was someone who worked in the Andalusian poets. Why would you study this stuff when you could study Yehuda Halevi? And I think, it's just, well, this is the kind of poetry that Abraham ibn Ezra couldn't stand. Abraham ibn Ezra couldn't stand this kind of elaborate poetry where the form was as important as the content. But the Ashkenazi Jews had a different aesthetic from the Sephardic Jews.
In line 80, there is Ariston Litzadikei, and in the early Birnbaum, he has a note that is a vague reference to Aristotle and was actually controversial. That's removed subsequently. And I wonder, do you think that this Ariston is a double entendre, or is that popular etymology?
I mean, it's hard to imagine that. I mean, my instinct, just shooting from the hip, would be that that's a popular etymology, and that I think the Jews of Ashkenaz had other. I don't know about the status of Aristotle in Ashkenaz at that point. That's really sort of just beyond where I really sort of want to make a statement on this. I mean, there are different manuscript editions of this text, and one of the things that's interesting is there are any number of translations and things. I think if you go on the web and you just sort of what's interesting is sort of in terms of the form and function content is that there are, I think it's the new conservative Machzor that lays out, that has the traditional Aramaic, but does sort of responsive readings drawn from biblical texts and things to sort of it's sort of like a riff on the theme, and it sort of preserves the antiphonal elements and other things, sort of an attempt to sort of translate the less textual parts of Akdamut into a contemporary American aesthetic, which I find interesting. So
Chaya Juni has been waiting for a while, so I'll just stop. So go ahead, Chaya.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a couple of short questions. The first one is just a clarifying question about the red Jews. I didn't understand, are they supposed to be the 10 lost tribes, or are they the Khazars? Or are they some sort of conflation of those two?
They're the 10 lost tribes. It's just a similar idea of sort of these.
Oh, sorry. I thought you had mentioned the Khazars. Secondly, I was really fascinated by the Maisa Akdamus. Is it written anywhere? Is it just something that's passed from mouth to mouth, or is there a canonical text?
So yeah, it's trying to see where I have. So yeah, the tale, it appears in Yiddish. I'm thinking Hoffman has sort of a whole marvelous description of how it came to be written, and sort of the textual witnesses and other things, including. So it appears it's in Yiddish, so it's or sort of old Judeo-German. In the it sort of depends on when how linguists classify different things. and that it's eventually translated into Hebrew. But it's one of those passages where someone has sort of a living translation. Let me see, here I have my Hoffman. So a copyist of the 1630 Hebrew edition says in his introduction, he'd known of the story, but it was only available to those who understood Yiddish, Lashon Ashkenaz. And even then it was only printed in 1 in 100 old Ashkenazi machzorim. So he says that he desired to make this miraculous story more available to the Jewish community beyond Ashkenaz. So he availed himself of another person who understood both Yiddish and Italian, Lashon La'az, because Israel Cohen did not understand Yiddish, so he translated it through oral Italian translation into Hebrew. So that's that's part of how the tradition spread, which obviously once printing presses are invented and liturgies start to circulate more widely, if anything, then we see sort of the spread of Akdamut Millin beyond. And I think it is possible, I think, to imagine how the folktale would have helped the poem itself spread beyond Ashkenazi. I mean, sort of, especially like why should people who don't have any sort of connection why do people who don't have connections to the Jews of the Rhineland, sort of, why should they want this hymn that's 90 lines long and in Aramaic? Oh, but it's got this great backstory, so we'll sing it sort of in Rabbi Meir's honor in a way. So.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, just one more thing. I just didn't understand in the illumination where the God figure was blindfolded.
That's Israel.
Sorry?
Israel is blindfolded.
Oh,
it's synagogue.
Sorry. Okay, yeah. As I said that, I was like, that's untraditional. But how is that a subversion? Like, how is it being used if it's supposed to be like different from the Christian motif? How is that being reinterpreted? I didn't understand that.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I love that image. It's from the Leipzig Machzor, I think, that the image, because she's blindfolded, but she's triumphant. And in a way, sort of the blindfold makes it clear to those who are familiar with sort of the visual culture of the outside world. You see like synagogue, at every major church, from the Middle Ages, whether it's near Notre Dame or, I was in Erfurt for a month before COVID. And, the first thing I did when I went to see the big church was like, oh, there's synagogue. She was kind of tired. But she's always sort of like tired and defeated, but that she sort of represents the Jews, and then you have sort of the triumphant ecclesia. And in a way, sort of the blindfold is what it takes to sort of like, I think, for that artist to sort of convey this is the Jewish people, but she's crowned also. Whereas, I mean, in the conventional synagogue iconography, like the crown is slipped and it's at her feet, or she's holding it, or it's like falling off her head or something. But here she's like really nicely crowned. And she's sort of like doing some sort of like hand, sort of like making sort of this like reaching her hand out to her lover. So I think and she's in a way, she's elevated. So she's in a sort of this position of power visually. So I think it's sort of it's like saying like, yes. And we see this also, there's there are various other places where we see in medieval Ashkenazi Jewish sources where you get a sense that the Jews have absorbed sort of anti-Jewish stereotypes about themselves in various ways. So there's like the Sefer Nitzachon, has a whole description about, it's a disturbing passage to read as a modern American Jew, but it has this whole passage about why Jews have ugly physical features. And it talks about how these sort of various features are they are concealing sort of the beauty that is inside, but it's sort of like they've picked up from the sort of like the larger culture that you want to be essentially like tall and blonde and have a little nose and all these, and they're sort of like they're sort of like saying like, yeah, we're not attractive by the general culture standards, but it's like it's concealing this sort of magnificent virtue that we have, and it's sort of it's like psychologically kind of complicated, but and there's even sort of questions about whether sort of like some of the strange depictions of people in some of the Haggadot and other things, whether, sort of how does that reflect sort of like Jewish self-image as we see in some of these. And the another sort of issue is in, a question which I don't know that, that it gets so complicated because a lot of the artists who illuminated manuscripts are not necessarily Jews, but they were sort of like, working from pattern books and other things. So I think, so it gets the interpenetration sort of Jews and Christians in Ashkenaz. I think we often picture them as being sort of like the Jews are sort of like in a ghetto locked away, but that's a much later idea. So I think there was a lot more exchange. And I think that's why like the Red Jews to me are so interesting, because it's like they have the same basic story in some way, only for the Jews, it's like, all right. Or for the Christians, like, who's scary?
Abigail, go ahead.
I was just wondering, because you mentioned the ta and like the circling back to that syllable, do you know why there are, like, I've seen at least one printing where like the ta is sort of like separated out in another column, and like on the one hand that emphasizes the rhyme scheme, and on the other hand it makes it almost impossible to like understand the words. And I was just wondering if you knew why that was a thing.
Yeah, and that's I think I have two different images that probably went by fairly early on, where it featured that, and there's even one where it has the groups of four. The ta is sometimes in black and sometimes in red, which seems to suggest sort of like the antiphonal performance. I think that has to do with the aesthetics of the poem being something beyond sort of the word by word content of the lines. I think that as soon as you start stressing, you have the acrostic, which especially the alphabetical acrostics are really fairly easy to hear. And then the ta, and every line having 10 syllables, so it can be very strongly rhythmic. That sort of the experience of sort of saying this, it's like you're sticking your landing every time you get to ta. And the point in a way is sort of like not so much the words as the experience, I think, of saying the words that manuscript tradition sort of illuminates. It also sort of, I think, helps, if you think about, who would have had the prayer books, I think, whether, if you're studying them, it actually sort of like just makes the poem even in a way sort of like more beautiful. Because when you're like flipping through, when you're like flipping pages online at the National Library in Israel, and you're looking through their digitized manuscripts and things, you always sort of stop when there's sort of this visually arresting image. And I think this poem, it makes, when they lay it out like that, you stop and you to look at it, it catches your eye visually. And I think also, if you think about it as sort of an aide de memoire for a cantor, that it also sort of stresses, it sort of primes him to sort of think like, oh yes, this is the one with the sort of like the slightly elaborate performance, that the manuscript itself sort of telegraphs that, as part of like preparing to lead it. So, but yeah, I think the manuscripts, they tell us, sometimes they tell us more than initially seems to be the case. But I do think you're right. It's not, it doesn't facilitate sort of translation to have the final syllable of each word just bumped out to the end.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Lieber, for this wonderful class. It was really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who joined us today here on Zoom. Thank you to everyone who joined us on Facebook Live. Tomorrow at 8 p.m. we have the third Pew Team of Shavuot class with Eats Landa, so I really hope to see you there. You can also find more information about that class and many of our other classes on our website at www.drisha.org/classes. Thank you again, Dr. Lieber, and thanks again to everyone who attended. And we really hope to see you soon at one of our upcoming classes at Drisha, either the one tomorrow night or one in the future.